In this video, I will cover Sartre's Being and Nothingness Part 1, Chapter 2. While this is meant to be a guide for those who are reading Being and Nothingness, this chapter focuses on anguish and bad faith. So if you're interested in introducing yourself to these concepts in Sartre's philosophy, this video will do that. I've tried to refer Sartre's terminology to common parlance in each video of this playlist so it could be understood by those who are not absorbed in the text. In my first video, I brought up Hegel's master-slave dialectic to introduce the relation between subject and object to the words I and me. This relation unfolds in many ways throughout Being and Nothingness, and it is useful to locate it in Sartre's discussion on anguish and bad faith. For Sartre, anguish is distinguished from anxiety in that anguish involves the fear of how you will handle a situation, as opposed to anxiety, which is when I fear something happening to me. So anguish involves your own agency, your own freedom, whereas anxiety involves your vulnerability as an object. In anguish, I fear how I might conduct myself in a certain situation. With anxiety, the fear concerns something happening to me, something happening to the object that is me. So we see within this distinction the relation between subject and object. Sartre uses the example of a soldier. The soldier may have anxiety over what may happen to him, how the enemy may act upon him as an object, whereas the soldier will feel anguish over how he will respond in a certain situation. We feel anguish concerning our own conduct. We feel anxiety concerning what may happen to us. In this way, anguish can be understood as freedom. It is the burden of choosing. It is consciousness of our freedom. It is the apprehension of our freedom as an object. It is the apprehension of our freedom outside of the immediacy of our situation, outside of the immediacy of action. Sartre gives an example of approaching the edge of a steep cliff. We feel in these moments the reality that we could jump off. It is entirely up to us to keep ourselves safe. Our freedom allows for the possibility of jumping off. We feel the burden of our freedom in these moments, and this burden is anguish. These examples are the most concentrated, visceral feelings of anguish, but anguish is felt with all of our choices, whenever we have the foresight to apprehend our choices from a distance. Do I take this job offer, or do I stay with the job that I know? How will I make new friends when I move to this city? These are all decisions that are felt from a distance through anguish, and this holds true concerning how we see our past and how we use our freedom to rewrite our past. Should I have taken this job? Should I have moved to this city? Now, anguish often leads us into bad faith, as bad faith is an attempted flight from anguish. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the experience of anguish coinciding with the foresight of a decision seen from a distance, outside of the immediacy of the situation. Now, Sartre establishes that our consciousness is always set up in a situation. Each end that an individual pursues, that a forward self pursues, both organizes the objects that consciousness is directed at, as well as provides the meaning that is conferred onto them. It is because we pursue some distant possible that we encounter smaller projects in this pursuit along the way. And all of these ends are directed by our value, which is our compass, leading us towards an abstract signification of an ultimate end, the in itself for itself, a concept we will cover later in the book. Our desires change, but we always have a desire. We always lack the being we have to be, and our apprehension of this being is an abstract signification of our ultimate end, that which we are always in pursuit of. And from this pursuit, objectives emerge, different possibilities come into light. We navigate a world that is cast under the light of our own pursuit. The glass of water is illuminated against the background of everything else because we are thirsty, because we lack hydration. This goes back to the introductory chapter on the pursuit of being, where Sartre describes consciousness as intentional, that it is always of something. Now, in our everyday existence, we navigate a world populated with obstacles and simple tasks. Sartre mentions trivialities like an alarm clock or a sign to keep off the grass, an assignment from our boss, and we designate these objects to make choices for us in a certain way. We don't have to think about them to navigate around them and with them. We do not have to deliberate. We do not have to worry about waking up by ourselves to go to work because the alarm clock does it for us, and we know that the alarm clock means that it is time to go to work. The sign that instructs us to keep off the grass takes most of the effort of our responsibility away from us in our determination of where it is okay and not okay to walk. We react to the guardrails against anguish, is how Sartre refers to them, in such a way as to bypass the fact that we supply their meaning. Sartre writes, "As soon as the enterprise is held at a distance from me, as soon as I am referred to myself because I must await myself in the future, then I discover myself suddenly as the one who gives its meaning to the alarm clock, the one who by a signboard forbids himself to walk on a flower bed or on the lawn, the one from whom the boss's order borrows its urgency, the one who decides the interest of the book which he is writing, the one finally who makes the values exist in order to determine his action by their demands. I emerge alone and in anguish, confronting the unique and original project which constitutes my being. I do not have nor can I have recourse to any value against the fact that it is I who sustain values in being." When we examine our freedom in the past or future, we fall into anguish because we realize that we are the source of meaning in the world, and yet we are brought into the world without a meaning given to us. We are responsible for that. We place meaning in the sign that forbids us to walk on the grass. We supply the meaning behind the tools we use to navigate the world. The objects we notice as we navigate everyday life situate us temporally and spatially in the world. We are the foundation of this meaning, yet we are without a foundation to supply us meaning. As we apprehend this condition of our consciousness, we experience anguish, the burden of our freedom. We feel this anguish in order to flee it. Sartre writes, "In anguish, I apprehend myself at once as totally free and as not being able to derive the meaning of the world except as coming from myself." Anguish is inescapable. We cannot overcome anguish, for we are anguish, and our recourse is to flee it. This is bad faith, and it concerns anguish about the future as well as the past. Sartre writes, "Flight before anguish is not only an effort at distraction before the future, it attempts also to disarm the past of its threat. We attempt to flee from anguish by attempting to apprehend ourselves from without, as another or as a thing." What Sartre is getting at here is how we resort to explaining away our responsibility through determinism. We could look back at our past and point to causal relations which led us to conduct ourselves in a certain way. This is how we make excuses for ourselves. We look to a determinism which led us to where we are, and in doing so we contemplate our freedom as if it were the freedom of another person. We could say to ourselves, "I was drunk, I was feeling sad, I didn't mean to act a certain way." Here, the inebriation is a force that is pushing us, like an object in a certain way. The sadness is also described as another object within us, acting upon us, and determining our actions. This form of bad faith looks to rewrite the meaning of the past. It is a flight away from the anguish that surrounds the choices we have made. Yet Sartre asks, how could we flee something that we are? There is something contradictory cropping up here. Sartre writes, "I can in fact wish not to see a certain aspect of my being only if I am acquainted with the aspect which I do not wish to see. This means that in my being I must indicate this aspect in order to be able to run myself away from it. Better yet, I must think of it constantly in order to take care not to think of it. I must aim at the object of my flight in order to flee it." Again, the meaning that is imbued into our situation, that unifies our situation, derives from an end that exists in the future, the being that we have to be, the pursuit of being that is not who we are currently, the being that includes what we lack. When we make excuses, we posit forces within us as if they are things. We configure certain drives, emotions as things, objects within us, acting upon us. We are attempting to fill the void that encircles us. We are attempting to identify things within us that make us what we are. We are making excuses. I engage in bad faith when I attribute the choices I make to things which happen to me. Sartre writes, "I can make myself guilty of bad faith while apprehending the anguish which I am, and this bad faith, intended to fill up the nothingness which I am in my relation to myself, precisely implies the nothingness which it suppresses." Let's unpack that. If I am apprehending the anguish which I am, then I am turning myself into an object. When Sartre uses the word apprehend, there is an object to be identified. The anguish that we are, the pressure we feel to fulfill certain obligations or needs, appear to us like an incalculable amount of separate forces, drives, obligations, and needs. When we engage in bad faith, we objectify these forces, thereby filling the void of the nothingness that we are. We use our freedom to rewrite our past freedom. We choose to see our facticity instead of recognizing our transcendence. This is crucial to bad faith. There is a deliberate choice to see facticity where there is transcendence, and to see transcendence where there is facticity. In other words, there is a deliberate choice to see our choices as determinations from forces outside of our control. In such cases, we attribute our actions to facticity instead of transcendence. And conversely, we use our freedom, our transcendence, when we are confronted with a criticism of someone else. We can be accused of being a certain way, in which case we are perceived as an object. Yet we can always explain ourselves out of the other's determination of us as an object, because we can always use our transcendence, claim ourselves as the being that we have to be, hide behind the opacity of our body, the opacity of our object state, the privacy of our own mind, our own freedom. So when perceived as an object by the other, we can escape this perception, this facticity, this being that I am that is made of my past. In our pursuit of a future self, our story is always unfinished. There is always a way of making the other's perception of you as an object an incorrect perception, or rather a perception made in bad faith by the other. Because we are not just an object, we are a transcendence too. So bad faith runs in two directions. When we use facticity to divest ourselves of our freedom, our responsibility, and when we use transcendence to evade the determinations of our being for others, our being as an object, as facticity. Sartre writes in regards to bad faith that bad faith must affirm facticity as being transcendence and transcendence as being facticity in such a way that at the instant when a person apprehends the one, he can find himself abruptly faced with the other. We can again see the relation of subject and object mapping onto these two terms as well. Transcendence aligns with the subject and facticity aligns with the object. When we use the word I, we speak from the source of our transcendence. When we use the word me, we speak from our facticity and our vulnerability as an object fixed into an uncontrollable world. What Sartre is describing here is the profound way in which we shield ourselves from an unpleasant truth for which we already have an awareness of. He is describing how we seemingly hide truths from ourselves. I say seemingly because we are not actually hiding anything from ourselves. We're not actually lying to ourselves. Bad faith refers to what we ordinarily describe as self-deception in common parlance. But when we consider the issue from a phenomenological perspective, we cannot reconcile the deceiver and the deceived into the unity of a single consciousness. So Sartre spends a bit of time in this chapter distinguishing these more familiar common sense understanding of human nature, and he brings it into a finer resolution, which is not to say that he makes it easier to understand, rather he gives a more accurate account of the nature of our consciousness. It is a complex enough of a subject to be difficult to grasp, even if we have a clearer image of it. Sartre writes, "If I were only what I am, I could, for example, seriously consider an adverse criticism which someone makes of me, question myself scrupulously, and perhaps be compelled to recognize the truth in it. But thanks to transcendence, I am not subject to all that I am. I do not even have to discuss the justice of the reproach. I am on the plane where no reproach can touch me, since what I really am is my transcendence. I flee from myself, I escape myself, I leave my tattered garment in the hands of the fault finder. But the ambiguity necessary for bad faith comes from the fact that I must affirm here that I am my transcendence in the mode of being of a thing." We are free to choose the meaning of our past and future. When we make excuses in bad faith, we are describing our freedom as if it were the freedom of the other, of someone else. For our decisions, our choices, in the immediacy of a situation, with all the spontaneity of our consciousness, surges up from being in itself, the being which we are, our being in itself for which we cannot apprehend, because it lies deep in the heart of an opaque being, as Sartre writes. Sartre spends some time distinguishing bad faith from the lie, from self-deception, and from the Freudian conception of the id and the ego. Sartre mentions that a lie presupposes my existence, the existence of the other, my existence for the other, and the existence of the other for me. This is all encapsulated in a lie. A lie implicates all of these objects and points of view, and it should be distinguished from bad faith in that bad faith hides a displeasing truth or presents as truth a pleasing untruth. Bad faith then has in appearance the structure of a falsehood. Only what changes everything is the fact that in bad faith it is from myself that I am hiding the truth. Thus the duality of the deceiver and the deceived does not exist here. Bad faith, on the contrary, implies in essence the unity of a single consciousness. The Freudian concepts that Sartre criticizes in this chapter are meant to re-establish the duality of the deceiver and the deceived. Sartre writes, "The very essence of the reflexive idea of hiding something from oneself implies the unity of one and the same psychic mechanism, and consequently a double activity in the heart of unity, tending on the one hand to maintain and locate the things to be concealed, and in the other hand to repress and disguise it." Sartre outlines the different conscious points of view that are presupposed in Freudian theory. There is a requirement of a mediating censor between the subconscious and conscious mind, a censor that can recognize and disguise some deep-seated impulse, trauma, or unpleasant condition. Sartre rejects this. He rejects the subconscious mind as outlined by Freud. Sartre instead emphasizes the unity of this mental activity that Freud attempts to account for. This leads Sartre to describe this unity as a being which is what it is not and which is not what it is. At first this seems contradictory, but notice how this defines the human being as a nothingness. The negations are what matter in this statement. The image of human nature that we get here is a being that is pulled apart and separated from itself on all sides. It is a being encased in nothingness. The pure nature of our being in itself is out of reach. We cannot apprehend ourselves as a totality because we cannot adopt a vantage point on ourselves. We are the vantage point we have. We cannot ever see ourselves as the being that has the vantage point from which it sees from. Meanwhile, the being that we have to be, the original choice that outlines our pursuit, is always in front of us, always out of reach in a future possible, always replacing itself as the immediacy of our situation follows its direction to meet up with it. The being that we have to be perpetuates its distance from us. Sartre explains this with an example of a coward. The nature of our being is that it is what it is not and is not what it is. If I have conducted myself in a cowardly way, I may flee this way of being by projecting myself as courageous, by pursuing courageous acts, as I can imagine this way of being. In which case I negate my being as a coward and throw myself towards what I imagine to be a courageous way of conducting myself. I may have conducted myself cowardly in the past. I may have been judged by this conduct to be a cowardly thing, a cowardly object. Yet I pursue a more courageous way of being. I imagine what this conduct would involve, and I pursue it through my transcendence. Sartre writes, "I do not know that I am courageous. Such a view of myself can be accompanied only by belief. Bad faith does not succeed in believing what it wishes to believe, but it is precisely as the acceptance of not believing what it believes that it is bad faith. Good faith wishes to flee not believing what one believes by finding refuge in being. Bad faith avoids the truth by referring to facticity where there is transcendence and referring to transcendence where there is facticity." Sartre uses an example of a waiter at a cafe who moves too quickly, demonstrates an eagerness to attend to his customers, and through this contrived conduct he attempts to be an object form of the waiter. He attempts to be a waiter thing, as if a waiter is a thing like a table or a chair, as if there is some definite thing that a waiter could be. Sartre also gives an example of a flirtatious couple out on their first date. A woman sees the subtle advances of her companion as facticity, as actions emptied of their transcendence. She understands the intentions of the man that she is with and wants to delay taking it to the next level. Sartre writes, she concerns herself only with what is respectful and discreet in the attitude of her companion. She restricts herself to the present actions without extrapolating the obvious implications of his advance. She wants to enjoy the desire he has for her without acknowledging its meaning, without acknowledging the full realization of his desire. So when he places his hand on her hand, she does not want to pull away and undo the charm of the moment, nor does she want to consent to furthering her intimacy, so she leaves her hand in his, but fails to notice that she is doing so. Her hand becomes a thing, and does not consent or resist. Sartre writes, she has disarmed the actions of her companion by reducing them to being only what they are, that is, to existing in the mode of the in itself. So with bad faith, we used the double property of our consciousness as being what it is not and not what it is, by using transcendence to escape our facticity, and by using facticity to step out of our transcendence. That's all I have for part 1. If you found this video helpful, please like the video and subscribe to my channel.